2020 was a tumultuous year. The question we must all ask going forward is simple. What values, ethics, and behaviors from the old world are we going to preserve? And what new perspectives are we going to embrace as we build our future civilizations? This is the New World Podcast with Ariz Kaki and Akil Samji.
Welcome back to the New World Podcast. I'm your host, Ariz.
And I'm your host, Akil.
And today's episode, we're going to be talking about social media, its effects on the world, and moreover, some of the pros and cons with regards to each social media platform that we've kind of witnessed come into fruition in our society. We're sort of approaching this episode from not a technical sense, but moreover, we're approaching social media in terms of how it originated from. It's essentially all the tools and the toolkit that come in the toolbox with social media, what you can do with social media, what people have done. We're going to go through the timeline of the emergence of some of these platforms. Yeah. And then we're going to look into the creation economy. So moreover, people like us who can create podcasts, but moreover, like your average YouTubers and people who just have made a significant amount of income, or at least literally the sole income on some of these platforms. We're going to go into not just YouTube, but Vine, the ones that went extinct. We're going to go into the more modern ones like TikTok. We're going to go into Twitter, the more divisive ones, and we're going to go into Facebook, the sort of issue about privacy in that sense. Then we're also going to touch upon Facebook in particular because of the monopoly some of these companies have, but particularly Facebook because it's the issue of privacy, and that's more related to some of the rise of the more modern technology that we see, like blockchain. So it's like an increased motivator of some of the trust issues between the public and these companies in particular. As I mentioned, we're going to go through the creation economy, and then we're going to end off possibly with two sort of separate, I guess, trend lines for future episodes. So we're going to kind of address mental health, which is going to be something that me and Akil are going to invest our time in and researching and studying and possibly having amazing guests around mental health. These don't have to necessarily be like your average counselors, but we're looking more so into the future, like we said, the new world solutions for some of these problems. And we're not going to say a lot here, but maybe some of you can guess where we're going with this. Okay. And then the second half is going to be the potential future of decentralization within social media. So that's sort of like your blockchain area, which we're also going to be touching upon in the future episodes as well. So we just want to thank you for tuning in today, and then we're going to get started. So Akil, do you want to talk about essentially the idea of getting our audience in tune with the predecessor of social media, sort of the era of globalization, sort of the mid-90s to like the early 2000s, or we saw some of these sites first start up, but maybe there's like a sort of social and geopolitical precursor to that. Like, how do we look into that?
Yeah, I guess the best way to look into that would probably be like the creation of the internet. And so I don't want to get into too much history, but basically the internet connects us all with the term like globalization, or as I said last episode, I was talking about the term glocalization, in which people from around the world can see what's going on in a local area from wherever they are. And so they get to tap in, like I said, through Spotify, through different types of music, or even Instagram and TikTok when people post like viral videos, right? And going back into globalization, we see how much people get connected, but also how much people get affected, and how people's mindsets might change because they look at news from the US, but even though they're in, I don't know, like a Eastern country or something, even though that's not really related to them, they're still understanding what's going on and the effects kind of what it has to their home country and where they're living and things like that, right?
Yeah, especially with globalization. As Akil mentioned, social media kind of took the same. The note that we ended off in the last episode was kind of teasing social media and how it's kind of the new 21st century tool, and it has its problems. Just as we analyze, the mainstream media has its problems. Similar problems from the mainstream media have kind of been diluted into social media. We're going to take that definitely down the road. But with the idea of globalization, I think if you look at the time period when all this started, when do you think it? If you go back and you think about this from like a long-term sense, how far ago or how long ago do you think this started, this era of globalization, when people began to actually care about what happened in the rest of the parts of the world, or like were aware of it? Do you think it started with like free trade agreements? Like
I would think so, because especially with all the wars and everything, people were still kind of connected.
Because Cold War just ended, so people were, because more countries opened up as a result of the fall of the Berlin Wall. So you had more countries relating to the Western powers. You had more developing countries all of a sudden come into power, like China. Modern day China, at least as of the end of the 80s, was still not in the place that it is today. It was still massively underpowered, and especially countries like India. But I think with regards to the free trade agreement, a lot of these so-called countries, or like you had NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, but then you also had like the formation of the European Union and these groups of nations that kind of believed in the free flow of information and trade. So more so the exchange of ideas and of physical, tangible products.
Exactly.
And that sort of culminated in this era, I think, of record prosperity in the late 90s. Because before 2001, arguably, there was really no major war from the fall of the Berlin Wall to like, apart from the Gulf War, but apart from that till 2001, there was I can't recall any there being like any major conflict that involved a group of countries. So I think this was like a really prosperous time, and I think this sort of gave rise, as you said, to the internet and its so-called first ever application. Like you had your websites and like things like AOL
and MySpace,
right? And people like dialed into like the internet or whatever still, and so people like were developing these like communication lines across geographies, and some people were not even just across major geographies, but like you were able to relate to someone from your city to like a different city. And this was kind of a globalizing thing, because if you, like, as we mentioned previously, like you were communicating, but like not to the extent where you like actually knew everything that was going on in the country that you live in, right? So,
it was more so, I think, like heads, like generals in terms of like war and everything would know what's going on.
Right.
Just because, like, for example, like NATO and whatever, they'd have to communicate, right, to go fight wars or do what they have to do.
Yeah.
But nowadays, like, anyone can get news on any other country regardless of where they are, right?
Yeah. So, and I think with that idea of news in comparison to like the episode that we did last week with regards to the news media, I think it is safe to say that there's pros and cons to the world we're living in now. I think with social medias, people believed that apart from social media's one feature being to communicate rapidly, it's essentially the major feature to kind of like interconnect or globalize the world.
Exactly.
It was the acceleration of the process of globalization. So it wasn't just an economic one, but it was more of like a technological one. It was more of like a communicative one. And I think the communication was also accelerated, but at the same time, people began to say, "Oh, maybe we can like relay news. We can build like another media companies, alternative media sources on these internet." And I think now, fast forwarding all these years later, since like the late 90s to like now, basically 2020 or 2021, we're now able to receive, learn, communicate, and like relay information at a faster rate than ever before. Like more amounts of data of information are being transferred from one part of the world to the next in our day at such a fast rate compared to before. And I don't think this has ever happened before. And sometimes it can come with this negatives, like information overload. Like the amount of stuff we see on social media, negative or positive. Sometimes we just get so many things bombarded at us at once. Sometimes you don't know what to do with that. That could rise to other problems, of course, which we'll talk about later down in the episode. But
that just reminds me of a funny thing. I don't know if you guys ever use Windows XP, but when you should download things, you know how it's a estimated time related, like 84 years or like some random large amount. And now all of a sudden things take like only an hour or like even 30 minutes to download that much information, which is insane.
Yeah, I think that goes also to like the development of broadband, like 5G and like that, which is a whole different story, different kind of rabbit hole to go down. But like looking at social media is like, we can automatically understand that the initial social medias were as a development of more countries or more parts of the world getting access to the internet. And when you built things like the broadband, and when you built things like actually like wired internet and eventually wireless internet, more and more parts of the countries or remote parts of the world got access to some of these technologies, some of these products, and were able to kind of share in, I guess, the development of the new economy that people essentially call the information economy, because you were freely exchanging ideas for the first time, because it didn't cost anyone besides to buy a computer or a console or a server to go onto the internet. So there's like this free like sharing of information. And I think it's pretty cool that apps like, you know, you had like your as like you mentioned, your MySpace, but you also had the arrival of like something like email, right? I think email was arguably like the first big social media titan, really, like or like idea that people used it for. I think people like with regards to more of the world being migrating onto these computers, you had this so-called free flow of exchange, but this also included within corporations and companies, right? Organizations, big organizations no longer needed to rely on like one meeting every week. And if you wanted to rapidly communicate some ideas, you were able to really compose and write a subject line and send a bunch of details regarding a meeting or something to work on. And I think that sort of first accelerated the increased the productivity of people, because when they sent emails, you could essentially coordinate a bunch of people onto one subject, or actually having them meet somewhere tangibly. So you could communicate en masse. Like you were able to now, before, this is way before text though, but you were able to like long form communicate ideas or something. Maybe a slow rate, maybe the time it took for one email to get to
and someone to
one
reply,
user and another server, like it took a long time, but I mean, it was a massive application, or at least a massive leap in the sort of story of the human species, I think.
Yeah.
Definitely. So do you want to go through like the timelines of like what essentially happened after the advent of the email? Because we know the email showed up, I would say, in like you had like sort of different versions of email like the mid 90s, but then something I guess happened moving into the 21st century. Because if you think about it, like some of the companies that we have today are like pretty much 10 to almost 15 years old, like the big ones, right? Yeah. We're talking like Facebook, YouTube. What else? We have Instagram. Well, Instagram is relatively new, but you have like your YouTubes, your Facebooks, and some of these Twitter, especially too, like 10 years old. So like something happened in the 21st century. That could be either the advent of more wireless broadband, and so that got more and more people onto it. But I think people realized that with the internet came decentralization, which we spoke about last time. I think with media, people, I think, looked at the internet as sort of being the answer to centralized areas of power, information, ideas, and just sharing things. You normally went to like a centralized physical location. I think with the technology of the internet, it was kind of given to this new generation of people that inherited it. And the whole idea was, okay, how do we decentralize all these centralized applications and like no one really owned the internet at that point. Like it was kind of like a wild west of the internet. So everything that was conventional was given this tool, and people essentially implemented the internet within all of these, I guess, avenues of life. So this included communication or selling things, because you had the first websites before Amazon that were doing transactions. The Amazon started in 1997, I believe. They started doing transactions. You could sell things now on the internet. You could meet someone up at like eBay. So these ideas were kind of brewing in, but then you had your big ones. Like we're talking the early days of like Facebook. So like, could you walk us through like sort of the timeline, or like at least what the motivation for some of these social media companies were, and maybe we can sort of paint a picture of how the world like looks like today with some of these social media.
For sure, yeah. So I guess the first one I'll start with is Facebook, because that's the biggest one. I know from doing a bit of research and like watching a movie, I think it was The Social Dilemma. The Social Dilemma. I know they talk about Facebook being a way to virtually meet your friends, and Mark Zuckerberg, he comes in, he wants to make it a global thing, and he ends up succeeding, and that's what we have till this day. And from Facebook, you can go into Instagram. Instagram kind of took Facebook, but took the tapping of the phone, like adding incentives for you to keep on staying on their app. And then I'll get into how Facebook bought Instagram and kind of made it similar. But going on to that, you have instant messaging on these platforms, like on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter. Now you can direct message people. You can even cold message your favorite celebrities. And if they reply, whatever happens,
How many times have you actually done that in your life?
No, maybe like once.
Like I feel like when I started, I was like, oh shit, Kyrie Irving, LeBron James. Let me text them, hey LeBron.
It was probably like a fan account or something that responded to you, right?
The blue check mark. But I'm wondering if someone in the staff, someone in the staff could reach out. But I think you're right. Like with things with regards to Facebook, but I think it became more so that like Zuckerberg essentially wanted to look into things like connecting yourself as a Harvard student before he dropped out. The idea was that he wanted to sort of get people within the same area, say greater Boston area, to kind of talk to each other. And like it could have been like used for dating, because he was also a college student at the time as well. So probably that could have been his motivation. I'm pretty sure it is, as from what I've heard from other sources. But like this idea that you could make friends, virtual friends, it seemed kind of like a radical new idea, because the idea was not only are you making friends in your city, but now this became us now, as it's a global thing. You can connect with anyone, anywhere, which is a beautiful thing, because it sort of removes the limit of geography for some people that have never been able to see their friends in such a long time. And then, as you mentioned, we had instant messaging. So this goes back to the email argument, which is email was sort of this long form messaging conversation, whereas with instant messaging is the arrival of SMS, especially with the development of the smartphone, and eventually you had your BlackBerry, and you had your iPhone,
BBM,
So BlackBerry Messenger, exactly. It's SMS technologies to kind of send people, instead of calling them and getting them like, yo, like here's my thing. Instant messaging kind of had us kind of glued to our screens at that point. I don't think there's this argument that people think that it was Instagram and these other social media companies like had us glued to our screens. But if I remember correctly, like growing up, being on like elementary school, I could always see older people that we knew texting on their phones. But it wasn't like us, but it was sort of like they were instant messaging each other on a faster rate.
I remember the phones that came with the sliding keyboards and everything. Like your
Blackberries and everything. I think those are being like tapped very quickly, because I think that's what people were using those for, especially the idea that like people were using majority of their time like on their phones. But if you think about it, like the internet app was there, but wasn't really good, and like you had your bootleg and your ghetto shit on those on those devices. But in reality, people used it still to call, but SMS was like a really big thing, because all of a sudden you were able to like send quick messages and like quick texts and stuff, and you would relay back and forth extremely quickly. And as broadband got better and it's continuing to get better, it probably gets like much more faster now to do anything you guys want to do. So
And
it's
I think, Facebook continued that email chain with like, posting on people's walls and pages, and you can see the whole reply and back and forth. So I think they kind of took that email aspect to put it on their social media so that people, get attracted and like, oh, I can use this now instead of SMS.
I think it was trying to get more long form into more digestible bites. I think that they wanted to keep to keep the long form idea because you could scroll back down and see all the records and all the receipts.
And then they came out with Messenger and
exactly over time. Yeah. So with regards to instant messaging, we can move on to things like Instagram and Twitter, right?
Yeah.
I think with Twitter, the idea was that it took, I think, the idea of SMS, the idea of like messaging it to people, and then Facebook kind of posted an update and stuff because Facebook at this point was growing very rapidly with Zuckerberg leaving and dropping out and kind of investing billions and billions, millions of dollars into developing Facebook. But you had people like Jack Dorsey at Twitter who essentially maybe thought that, okay, what if people want to keep like throw a tweet? Like everyone throws a thought out there.
Exactly.
The idea is like, how could you facilitate an area where people can throw a thought out there and then they can essentially have the idea of the algorithms kind of came into place at this point because with Facebook, you knew your friends.
Yeah.
But then other than that, you really didn't initially really communicate with anyone else unless you went out of your way to add someone. You would actually exchange Facebook information in person right? Or text, like, give me your Facebook. You wouldn't really like have the suggested.
Exactly.
I don't think I'm pretty sure like mid 2000s, like we're talking 05, 04. I don't think you had that capacity already yet. But I think with Jack Dorsey and the advent of Twitter, you sort of had this idea that like people want to throw a tweet out there, and it could have been politically, I guess, motivated. But the idea was that, let's say the average person just wants to share like how their day is going or any thought or any blurb, they can just tweet it.
Exactly.
The idea like the tweet or like this blurb, like something they just throw out in the world and they can go away. I think he realized that like if I let it go in terms of long-term content, long-term form content, people will just go rambling on. I think it'd be tough for the not just the servers, but just in general, like will the attention span of the user, or not just the attention span, how long will the customer be retained? Right?
That's true.
Twitter's business model would be the longer they have you on Twitter. And I think going to more of the present day problems with a platform like Twitter, it makes sense now. Maybe we can critique that decision whether or not like removing the idea of long form is bad because it's given a rise to a whole new problem, which essentially has happened at least a decade later from the formation of some of these companies.
For sure. Yeah. And even looking at Twitter now, they started with the whole 144 characters, I think only one tweet. Yeah. And if you tweeted another, I don't think it was attached at that time. Like you have to go on the person's profile to see it.
I don't know how effective like the idea of like the thread was. But then they just increased it because people thought that like they wanted to fit more things in like otherwise the thread would be useless to click or whatever.
But nowadays they have a thread, which is kind of weird.
Yeah, you've extended the amount per tweet, but at the same time you're also allowing threads as well.
Exactly.
But then as we said, it comes up with this whole different set of problems, especially with regards to the idea of context, as we spoke about last episode with media and how they report on certain stories. Which is, I think it gets into the whole part of social media that was supposed to be a substitute for centralized news and bias in media, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, definitely. And with Instagram, Instagram, I think, was a big leap forward because with Facebook, you shared pictures and I think people commented on each other's pictures and the like button was introduced on Facebook, and Facebook kind of did the whole incentive structure. But if you think about it from a psychological perspective, Instagram took it differently because I think people majority initially used it just to post pictures. Like, it was not really like a personal thing. I don't think so, wasn't it?
No, it was just to post pictures. And I know a lot of people told me too, their parents started using Facebook, so they didn't want to go on it either.
It was a generational change. People, the adoption was like really quick, especially with Facebook. I think with Facebook though, the idea of the like and comment section of the sort of sections like the liking and comment, I think that was the whole placate on like the dopamine hit.
Exactly.
For people who because now there were, as more and more people had as the cost of having a smartphone and possessing a smartphone went down, I think more and more people began to wonder whether or not like more people began to invest more time into this device. And so Facebook probably thought like, okay, like we need to develop these ideas of how when apps came out, people developed then before they got Facebook on their apps, they were on their computers. But as smartphones became a thing, then more and more people began to download apps onto smartphones. And the model, as remember Steve Jobs did in that famous keynote of his with the App Store, the idea was to retain you as long as possible.
Exactly.
The psychology of apps is very impressive, considering the fact that I always go in a rabbit hole whenever I'm on YouTube.
Exactly.
Because the idea is, or like now more so it's spread to like Netflix and stuff. But the same concept, the idea of taking something like binge eating or binge drinking. That idea of having or of saying to yourself that you're going to have a bit, and then taking a taste, and then something hits you, but it's not enough. But it was slightly enough to trigger some part of you that's like mammalian.
Exactly.
And so you eat more and more and more, and then you drink more and more and more. And from this context, I think it was you spend more and more time on social media scrolling. And I think with the scrolling effect, I think with regards to the Social Dilemma documentary, the idea of the whole replicating at the casino, like
the slots,
that was it's really interesting to see that those actually like people didn't realize. If you haven't checked that documentary out, it's a really good documentary to kind of go into what we're doing over here. But the Social Dilemma was a pretty cool insight, scary but kind of cool insight into how some of these like social media companies initially the thought of the like button, the tap, kind of like a serotonin hit, almost like a modern day like psychoactive drug, but that was digital. It really didn't come into your body. If it's like screwed out into brain chemistry, same way a natural drug would, but this idea like a heart or like a like, and then this idea that the like told you how many likes you got, so then you start to become competitive, because then the idea with the competition is the more likes you got, then the idea of like social status was now coming into the digital world. Like, okay, this, and then the number of followers, that number count and the count of numbers told you how much clout you had on social media in comparison to real life. And the idea of real life was the more friends you had, of course, the more popular you were. So the same thing translated over to this digital platforms, right?
Yeah, and I think Instagram was really smart with the whole double tap to like, because it's so much easier than having to find that like button and pushing it. And so it keeps you on that app all the time, right? And even looking back at how Facebook bought it, they started making it similar to Facebook. They added direct messaging, they added stories. So now it's like basically you're on Facebook, but you're on Instagram actually. But and it's either way Facebook makes money.
The story with like Facebook, Instagram, and I think you could group these social medias up into like certain categories that kind of relate to each other. Like because Facebook is owned by Instagram, and then you have your instant messaging apps now, which are more diverse than previously. Because the idea was with SMS, it was based fully on the SIN number and like your phone number. Then you wanted to kind of group message. So then you had like your BlackBerry Messenger. Then you had like your iMessage. And then you had like Windows Messenger, laptop, MSN. But the ones that survived, that essentially made their way onto becoming mobile apps, which became the new battlefield in I would say the 2010s. I would say the 2000s was more like all your desktop applications, and then your 2010s became your mobile applications. That was a mobile boom, right? That's when you had those whole Silicon Valley stories of like kids dropping out school and becoming like app developers. I think the whole app blow up happened ever since we became like purely smartphone based, right? I think with regards to that story, like you could group them up as saying like, okay, you had the messaging apps, which is supposed to be like a back and forth like communication, hi, hello communication. Then you had your YouTube, which was essentially a beast of its own, video sharing platform. Then you had things like Facebook, and then later Instagram, which bought it, essentially becoming your own personal space on your parking spot, your real estate on the internet. Basically, when someone came to your Facebook profile initially, saw your picture, but all of a sudden you had pictures of you on the internet. So it's a revolutionary idea for its time, right? And then you had your Twitter, which is a different one, and then you had your Vine and TikTok, which is kind of in the same area too. So I think you have sort of have like 4 or 5 various categories of social media. I think when people conflate like big tech or social media, I think people need to realize that like the big tech part is regards to like how they're all monopolizing on some of the information and on different companies. But when you're trying to deal with some of these solutions or talk about some of these social medias, honestly, I think it's you have to be a bit more fair and I give it a bit more scrutiny, because some of these social medias were built separately, like differently, and they're not meant to be sort of
like together, I guess,
together in uniform. They were all serving different purposes. Like if you just mentioned with Twitter, Jack Dorsey probably thought like, okay, he probably looked at Facebook and was like, okay, you know what, like I get it, but what if I want to make a totally simpler product, like not too much investment up front? Because the simple, as in a previous episode, we had Hotep on when he spoke about the fact that like some of the most biggest companies today that you think of start off with the most smallest lines of code.
Exactly.
And like Twitter, even if looking at like the design issues are perfect, but looking at it in terms of its functionality and the sort of program that it provides, it doesn't seem to be that much of a complex product as Facebook does. And I think the biggest projects, as he said, start off with the simplest lines of code. Right? Facebook, get Craigslist, or some of these like sort of buying apps like eBay. You can tell that the design hasn't caught up yet, but as simple projects as they were, it was a pretty like incredible feat. The fact that someone like Jack Dorsey realized that like, okay, I could learn from some of these. I think that's what social media companies from the 2010s till today are. Is that every time there's a new platform that comes out that gets acquired by some of these companies are generally something that like I remember reading in a book called The Blue Ocean Strategy, which is the idea that some of these founders or these new like up and coming founders that studied the social media titan that came like a generation before them, the idea was to see whether what parts of society or what these social media companies that came before them weren't addressing. So I think with regards to Instagram, the initial founder could have been like, okay, that one's kind of like personal Facebook, but then this is like purely for photos. Like there's no, I think like you can edit photos and then kind of make some parts glossy and then post that and to show like purely a photo page. And not be like a long form writing page. And then despite Facebook acquiring them, the idea was that, okay, like I'm going to analyze what Facebook gets right.
Right, exactly.
I'm going to keep that. What Facebook gets wrong, remove that, and then what I could add my own personal.
Yeah, like fill in the gap, right? Yeah.
I believe every company is really just an iteration of that.
Exactly.
That they take a formula, they take their leading competitor in the industry, they analyze them, they break them down into like what they do right, what they do wrong, what we can add or we can decrease. Put that all together in a book called Blue Ocean Strategy, where they talk about this. They give an example of like Lyft and Uber.
Yeah.
Like Lyft takes parts of Uber that are good as the initial idea of tipping the driver.
Exactly.
And then it becomes an entirely different company. And of course, Instagram wasn't as big as Facebook, but they got acquired for billions.
Exactly.
So, I mean, I think some of these social media platforms, like we said, address different types of problems, but they're getting grouped in more so now, in more recent times. I would say the last 4 to 5 years, this idea of whether or not some of these social media companies are considered modern day like monopolies.
These are like conglomerates too, like we were talking about before.
Yeah,
right?
Before we get into that, we can maybe touch upon YouTube and Twitter, TikTok, or YouTube and TikTok, or do you want to look at the monopoly first?
I would say we can go to the like attention span kind of thing. Yeah.
But then we maybe talk about the monopoly, then we can move on to the sort of translation.
Okay.
So we'll look into the idea of like the Facebook monopoly in particular, because as you guys probably know, in more recent years, Facebook has come under fire for having these lack of ethics with regards to privacy issues of their customers. And so the idea was that like you had Facebook getting onto apps and sort of stealing people's data, as you've heard a lot of these companies have, which is more so like a more modern day issue that has come up, is like people didn't realize it for the longest time, this idea of like your data being stolen from some of these big tech companies and being sold to, I don't know, third-party companies, political campaigns, whatever. We saw with 2016, we saw that being a huge problem. But more so, we don't really know exactly what's happening, because some of this data now we realize is being sold to advertisers based off your current previous viewing.
Exactly,
So that's kind of creepy in a way, because it gives the power to these big tech companies to see exactly what you're doing, like your exact algorithm, to see like what you're doing and how this all looks, like how you are as a person, because your browsing history shows what kind of person you are. Because if you're looking for like pans all the time, and you're certainly on the side getting like Google ads
for pans,
like Facebook ads for pans, it's kind of like a bit you probably will wonder like, okay, like, I mean, it's convenient for them, and maybe sometimes people just for a long time people probably thought of it but didn't put two and two together and realize, okay, you know what, maybe something else is happening over here rather than just being like a friendly algorithm suggestion feature.
And I think Facebook was really smart too, because they acquired Instagram, and I think more recently WhatsApp too.
And they paid like lots of money for that.
But WhatsApp is smart because it goes back to the whole instant messaging thing, right? Where you can message now anyone in the world for free instead of just people in your local area or your area code.
I think with Facebook, with regards to the monopolies, and now that you mentioned instant messaging, when Facebook Messenger came out, did WhatsApp buy Facebook Messenger prior to?
I don't think so. No.
I'm not sure about the whole history of that, but the fact is that already Facebook mastered the short form in their own version. And when they acquired Facebook, and when they acquired WhatsApp, they now owned so much of the instant messaging market.
They got international,
and it tells you because WhatsApp essentially connected people through distance. Like you have other companies like Viber, or those other companies that kind of flopped on the side, but WhatsApp did something that kind of revolutionized that. And the moment I think Facebook took that over, not only did they have Facebook Messenger, they now had WhatsApp. So they now had their more domestically Facebook based already. The people who knew the brand Facebook wanted to continue. Now you had WhatsApp, which was all of a sudden getting mass adoption because it was cross-platform, I think, right? And so like people took, when Facebook bought WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger, now they had access to allegedly they have access to all these like messages. But the idea is that they now have control of WhatsApp, they have control of Facebook Messenger, they have control of Instagram, and they have control of Facebook. Now Facebook, as we know, as you said, the joke was that more and more boomers are getting on Facebook. It's like the idea is, well, like there's almost, I think, 1 billion plus users on Facebook at this point. And then with Instagram, you have sort of the millennial generation trying to get into that. They transition away from Facebook, goes to the Instagram time. And I think with Facebook having their thumb on each part, which is like instant messaging, everyone uses instant messaging at this point. With Instagram, you catch the millennials. With Facebook, you catch the grandparents and the parents that are on there, like might not be like sharing anything, pictures or whatever, but still communicating on Facebook Messenger, but want to see and meet their friends and stuff like that. So I think it's very impressive, and it's a pretty good thing to consider for the at least post 2020 in terms of like what are the ethics around some of these monopolies. I think because when we link back to the episode with Yaron, he said, for those of you that know, Yaron was episode 4, I believe, or 3. Our first sort of high-profile guest on the show. And he's an objectivist philosopher. And for him, he essentially believed that from an objectivist perspective, that he said monopolies in terms of cornering the market, as long as they're not getting essentially any, I think, government intervention, which would make it fascism, he believed that some of those antitrust laws that were signed in the late 19th century were pretty much bad in his eyes. Uh, for those of you that don't know, the term monopoly is and why it's sort of being thrown out now is it goes back to this idea, the board game basically, where the whole goal of the board game of Monopoly is to like be like, okay, look, I'm gonna roll the dice, I'm gonna get on every single I'm gonna get what was it?
Boardwalk and Park Place.
Yeah. There we go. And you get those two blue category ones. So when someone lands on my property, you have to pay up. So then the idea was you bought all the properties, and then like as you mentioned, the moment someone gets on your property, you have to pay them. And the more real estate essentially you buy up of the game or the monopoly world, whoever owns essentially has a monopoly over the game. Exactly. That's the whole idea. You're the monopolizer.
And I think the term comes back from even colonization too, because when Britain colonized a bunch of countries, they had monopolies over them. They would
and those
send them.
Especially government monopolies were the most dangerous because, like, if you look at the British Raj in India, or if you look at sort of the British Civil Service and the British East India Company, like, and I think. But more in the modern context, at least the last sort of dealing that these people's had with monopolies goes back to, I think, the late 19th century. We have people like robber barons. I don't know if you've heard of that term before, but the idea was the initial industrialists that came out of the United States, start of 1900s. So that period in prosperity was the sort of culmination of a few decades of the Industrial Revolution. And you had essentially the world's first ever billionaires come up. Those were your like Carnegies. Those were your like Vanderbilts. People built the railways, and each one essentially was a monopoly in a global commodity. So you had like the Rockefellers in oil, like Standard Oil. So today all your gas companies are broken up, but they all originated from Standard Oil. The fact that Rockefeller owned the majority of the world supply, making him a global monopoly. And so even like with Carnegie, another like steel magnets, you had your railway magnates or whatever. You had all these sort of figures that were the monopolies. And I think, and they said like at the time, like these governments passed antitrust laws, or to like sort of break up these monopolies because they believed that they were holding too much of a percentage of the market, and therefore they would be able to manipulate the price, because the more of the market you own, the harder it is for any other company to come up and compete with you. Exactly. It's not just the competing; it's the idea that you actually set the standard.
You set the barrier to entry, right?
And so it's no longer the free market; it's the market cornered by you, not the market, not the people benefiting off the service or the product. It's sort of like, okay, like Standard Oil dictates the price of oil globally, not the OPEC nations, but you do. And then you sell it to other nations. You tell other nations how to price it. And that's kind of, we're getting to difficult territory. Some of these companies were split up and broken. And I think the critique of the idea of being opposed to monopolies is that, okay, monopolies exist. If you break them up, a lot of people who are the critiques of who are anti-breaking up, like Facebook or some of these newer ones, is that if you look at the example of like Standard Oil, when Standard Oil was broken up, essentially, all of the new companies that came out of Standard Oil, after 2 generations, joined together again into like 3 smaller magnates.
Oh wow! Okay.
So the argument is that like monopolies will just sort of reincarnate into something different, but they're still going to be like cornering different parts of the market. So essentially, you're not going to create one major one. You're still going to create like 2-3 different players,
minor ones.
Right? So like you had your BP, and you had your. Not BP, my bad. You have like Esso in Canada, but you have like other companies too, right? You had your Exxon Mobil, which were all Shell. They were all formed as a result of government cracking down on Standard Oil and breaking it up. And I think that was sort of the critique of that time, which was that you're not really going to accomplish anything by breaking up these monopolies. And that was the first time in history where you had monopolies, because this is the first time when a few individuals cornered majority of the world's supply in certain commodities, right? And I think in a more modern sense, people are now today using those antitrust laws of the late 19th century to apply to the laws today.
Social media,
and they essentially think that they believe that some of these big tech companies, particularly like they've called out not just the social media ones, but they've called out Google, they've called out Twitter, they've called out Facebook, primarily those ones for having a monopoly in some of the market. With Google, it's sort of the search engine algorithm,
and YouTube too.
And then now more so how much they control YouTube. And monopolizing there, which we'll get into, is YouTube being a different thing. But and with Facebook, with regards to how much information and privacy is being sold, that was the whole issue of Facebook in 2016, which people believe that they were selling off people's information.
Exactly.
And then with Twitter, it's a more modern sense, censoring of information, the free speech argument. So I think these are some of the debates that are, I think, happening now, and I think it'd be really interesting to see what happens. As far as I've heard, that the way these companies escape from the breakup is something called Section 230. And I think this is the main clause that was passed, I believe, when the internet first came about.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So Section 230, I believe, I don't know if it was Bill Clinton or George Bush, the idea was that, like, okay, these sort of platforms would not necessarily be considered like publishers, like the whole newspaper argument. That like if you had a newsstand and you had this sort of newspaper, let's say, Now, your job as a newsstand was to be a distributor for these newspapers.
Exactly.
Now, if someone on one of these newspapers, let's say, for example, wrote a bad story or said something offensive or defamation of character, for example, let's take the best thing, not the free speech, defamation of character, called out some figure in the local town and said, this has happened. And then you're the newsstand. And then you sell that paper to that same figure. And let's say that guy's like, wait, what the hell is this? I'm going to shut you down. In reality, the newsstand is protected because in reality, they're not the ones they're just a platform.
They're just the messengers.
They're the distributors and the messenger. And the person who was the publication who made that initially was responsible. I think that same idea, the newsstand idea, translates to today's social media platform. And so Section 230, I think, was passed as a result to protect some of these social media company platforms as being like platforms. That's the idea. They're not really the distributors of news. They're not the journalists. They're not the producers of news. And so anything that happens on their platforms are not essentially, the idea was that they're not essentially reliable.
At fault, right?
At fault. And I think something happened with regards to that, because for the longest time, I think that was the case. I think with the whole 2016 election and the mess that created, I think these companies were being told and pressured, I think, all of a sudden from a political sense to favor one side over the other.
Exactly.
And I think they've been screwing up ever since because they've been juggling both. On one hand, they're trying to satisfy governments around the world. They have issues with Australia now because they're banning free speech there. And then there's like issues with all these governments. And at the bigger they grow, they're kind of juggling this whole thing, looking at themselves like, okay, like what do we do? So I think this is a new gamble that we have, which is whether or not some of these big tech companies, particularly the ones that have a monopoly on information, the ones that we use every day to get our consumer news and content, how much do we still classify them as a monopoly? Which is still a question that's being debated because of Section 230. But B, what is the end result about that? And C, like, people might not understand, but we have to understand how we got here in that first place.
Yeah, and I just wanted to go back and relate that whole monopoly argument to social media's monopoly and Facebook's monopoly, because as you said, like with the Rockefeller Group, there wasn't room for competition. And you can kind of see that now. Facebook bought Instagram and WhatsApp, and they added statuses to all of them. They added direct messaging. They basically made it all the same platform. And now you look at Twitter, and in my opinion, I feel like Twitter kind of succumbed, because now all of a sudden you have Twitter threads, you have direct messaging on Twitter. And because they saw what Facebook was doing, they knew that Facebook was retaining a lot of people. And they're like, we have to do something to retain our people on our end, right? So we basically have to become like Facebook the most that we can be. And you can see how the influence of having a monopoly is on other people, because there's no room for competition. There's no room for original ideas. Because if you fail, you're out, and the monopoly still wins. Right?
I think with Twitter, the best example we covered with the Hotep episode was Parler. Those of you that don't know, Parler was an app developed as like sort of like a right-wing alternative to Twitter. The idea, essentially the critique of Twitter in the more modern sense, is that Twitter is acting and favoring political bias. And that is political bias. And what they're doing is they're removing certain tweets and content that's being posted on Twitter to fake that. So essentially is a defense of one side over the other.
Exactly.
And the whole notion of Twitter was this like idea, like people putting blurbs out there, which is bringing in the idea of free speech involved. And if Twitter, whether or not Twitter was just a platform, that's the whole section.
Exactly.
It's like, are they responsible for offensive? What's offensive? The whole free speech comes is a whole different episode in and of itself. But I think with Twitter, you had the idea of Parler, and some people believe that Parler did something wrong with regards to having they're like, fine, they've been told the whole time, just rhyming people. If you feel like you're getting hurt, use the free market village.
Exactly.
People feel like they built their own and they got shut down because of what happened on January 6th, if you guys don't know. And with Hotep, I believe he spoke about the fact that another right-wing alternative, like Gab, is still up, but Parler isn't, because they didn't build their servers. They built it on Apple and Amazon, so they kind of had it coming. But I get both sides of the argument. But that's what I'm saying is like the fact that that there were these other companies, other alternatives like Parler. But with Twitter, I think more importantly, with regards to some of the problems that we see with I think if you shift away from the monopoly, I think if you look at Twitter in of itself, I think it's more so the idea that people are now becoming more toxic on social media.
That's true too. Yeah.
Like with some of these groups like Facebook and Instagram, not only do you have like your friends and everything, but you sort of have this idea of the algorithm in the social dilemma, which is, as you said, sort of becoming a more constant thing amongst all of these monopolies. Is that at the end of the day, the motivation, and you have to always find the financial incentives. The financial incentives for a lot of these big tech and social media companies and platforms is the fact that they want to retain the customer retention. And they want to pay the least fee, right? The fee that you pay for customer retention. Back. And so the idea is some of these companies feature ads. Like Facebook makes so much money because they feature ads catered to you. And the data is that whatever you interact with, they sell the data privately to other companies, featuring their data, their commercials, ads, whatever to you, the user. And so with regards to Facebook and Twitter, the idea is to keep them on the platform as long as possible. Now, it's gotten to the point, I think, when it comes to things like the news, as we mentioned in the previous episode, is that the idea of the bias, I think, has seeped into the social media space. Which now it's a bit worse because your whole idea is placated to keeping you on the platform.
Exactly.
So the incentives of the company are to just show you what you like to hear all the time, never a different opinion. Not just policy, but like basically, if you're a car enthusiast or if you're like an AI enthusiast, you're going to see posts related to that.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that could be a good thing and a bad thing because you're not exploring new ideas, which is a bad thing. At the same time, a good thing is you're being constantly updated on the newest things. So there's, like I said, it's not really a black and white issue. It's more of like a
gray area. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
So that's essentially what Twitter did. And I think with regards to what you said earlier, which is the Twitter thread, when we think back to the last episode with the media, we said one of the biggest problems with the media today is that the reason why societies are becoming more bifurcated socially and divided is because they're not using the C word, context.
Yeah.
And I think social media's whole advent at the start of the 21st century was, okay, we're going to decentralize the internet. We're going to decentralize access to the information.
Exactly.
And everyone and anyone can communicate, and those same ideas of free speech and the same ideas of debating ideas intellectually are going to stay on the internet. It's going to be like a new realm, a new town hall, a new sort of town square to come address your ideas. And I think more so where the idea of monopoly comes into play, which is all of a sudden these companies are not buying more and more corners of the internet for themselves. And so people are still wondering whether or not the internet 1.0 still exists now.
Exactly.
Right? And I think that's what the idea of context is, because with regards to Twitter, you can tweet something or a thread of tweets. So a thread is like a series of multiple tweets.
Yeah.
And the idea, sometimes like the last one shows up.
Yeah, you have to click show this thread.
And the idea is that because the incentive structures are there, some of these companies, they basically, the algorithm favors the most often raunchiest, triggering, horrible, like cussing and like radical shit at the beginning forefront of every user. So if you look at the trending area, things that are trending are generally the most earth-shattering, groundbreaking thing ever. Like whether it be like a certain figures or a certain thing that just happened recently, it always shows you trending. So generally we all click there to see, and we get like the most radical. And in that Twitter thread, we get the worst of the Twitterverse, all there ready for our priming. And all of a sudden we get this visceral reaction, whether we like it or not. We don't know.
It doesn't even matter if it's in the middle or the end or like whatever.
Just gather that up. They put the raunchiest ones in front of you. And I think this goes back to another thing, which is if you come across a person that you disagree with, or if you come across a new person that you haven't learned from before, you basically look at the Twitter portfolio and you just see a tweet come up, taken out of context.
Exactly.
And the funniest thing is that because it's limited to 240, 200 the funniest shit at the end. And I'm like, what the fuck is this guy saying? He's a horrible person. And it's like, no, it turns out if you show this thread,
then you'll see what they're talking about, right? Yeah.
And I think we have to, I find that very ironic, which is, or it's just, I don't know if it's irony, but it's strange, is that the idea of context just went out the window. And I don't think Twitter, or more so over the idea of this short form, as we've sort of moved now, transitioned, as you can see, like majority of our attention spans as a generation, Gen Z, has gotten shorter. And I think this is being placated to multiple things, not only watching videos, but more so over the Twitterverse, because it's easy to read a tweet. I can read, okay, done.
Exactly.
I need issue on an event or a news story. Okay, I was going to read the news. Instagram, I might share a story. On the Twitterverse, I share a tweet. I follow some journalist. He shares a tweet.
Exactly.
Many journalists have biases. Am I going to go through the effort of reading every journalist tweet? No, shouldn't be through Twitterverse. I follow because I'm in an echo chamber. So I'm going to get the same tweet over and over again from different people, essentially giving me confirmation bias. And I know exactly what I'm talking about. This is the end. All I'm right. No one else is right. Anyone who says otherwise is wrong. So that's creating this sort of bifurcation in society. And I think with regards to context, it's hilarious because as we mentioned last week, we gave the example of interfaith groups. With social media, the incentive is to keep you on, and the incentive is to have the most raunchiest shit come to the top.
Exactly.
If you think about like an example, like I'd love to use an example to relate this to, which is like interfaith groups. Let's say, for example, you have like an imam, and you have a pastor, and you have a rabbi, and the idea is when they gather up, everyone knows that there's differences, but everyone starts off with what they have in common.
Exactly.
You get to the raunchy shit at the end because it's not considered raunchy at that point. It's just considered a disagreement. And there's a what is that term? Agree to disagree. There's this idea that we all agree that we disagree with each other with regards to what makes our individual faith groups different and unique. With Twitter, there is no such thing, because you see a person, you are, as we all know, you are similar to the people of all humans, then you are different, right? We all share the same, that you've heard that spiel. But you don't see that on Twitter, because in Twitter, you're not meeting a person face to face, you're seeing a virtual screen avatar, whatever, and a Twitter thread. You end up seeing the raunchiest tweet, and then you just immediately shoot back. The thing about Twitter is that if the idea of social media was to have more long form conversations, the beautiful thing would have been to establish context of the conversation
exactly,
and label you out. And so at the end, when you get to the person's thesis, essentially, you knew all the background information coming
exactly,
in. And I think those incentives are long out the window because as a society, with regards to everything else that's gone wrong, essentially with the iPhone, with more time being spent on our screens, we're programmed, I guess, as we're conditioned at this point to be short-term thinkers. And I think that's the biggest problem with regards to Twitter and content. I think with regards to Twitter, you have this instant rundown of everything because you're busy because the world's getting faster and faster.
Exactly.
And I think that relates more over to the general idea of all of our attention spans getting shorter. And I think if we relate that to the next big social media titan, it would have to be YouTube. Because for the longest time, like when you looked at video and visual, you had the advent of the film industry.
Exactly.
The average person couldn't, like initially in the beginning of the 20th century, you went to the film theater, the movies were shorter, and they got longer. They were built to tell more complex stories with higher budgets and everything else like that. You went to a movie, you sat there for a longer time because you loved the story. Humanity loves stories, like the arc, whatever. And then with YouTube, essentially the idea was beautiful, as we all the social media ideas were. You wanted to decentralize access for creators to create something, and you wanted a video sharing platform. So it kind of came up in this 21st century idea of like decentralizing things and making things the barrier of entry to create anything lower and lower.
Exactly.
And with YouTube, over time, it became a behemoth. And same thing with YouTube and Google, is that now they're being questioned whether or not they're having a monopoly. In their case, the idea is that they're sort of taking videos down, demonetizing them for creators, or shadow banning them. The idea, the term has been floated around. And you have all these congressional hearings with all these CEOs sometimes, and just like a back and forth banters, whether or not are you censoring one channel, are you demonetizing one channel, and how they're changing the recommendation system. So now the algorithm is not just neutral, it's more being programmed to be favoring to one side or the other. So these are some of the arguments that are being thrown out there with regards to YouTube. But yeah, I think with short attention spans, if you think about it, like some of these initial videos, they were short, then
they're like 30 seconds to a minute long,
and then over time, like people began to tell bigger stories, and then they again shortened and shortened. And I think like led to the whole idea of the creation economy, right? For the first time in history, you've always had like artists and like creators of something, playwrights, whatever. With playwrights, then came film. And then with film came the idea that like, okay, not everyone can be like a Scorsese or like buy huge like camera equipment.
Become the next Michael Bay, you know?
Exactly, And instead, people were like, the idea of the vlog came into play. The idea like somehow one dude can pick up a camera and talk to it and show them how like daily life is.
For like 12 minutes.
People just related to it all of a sudden, right? And then it goes back to the thing that we spoke about in the first episode, which is that the reason we started the podcast is because people want to relate to it. And I think more people relate to creators that look like them and experience the world through their eyes as well, because there's some sort of commonality that they can watch through the videos. So yeah, with regards to the creation economy, is that you essentially had the start of these online celebrities. It's like a new brand of celebrities began to play, right? You had the online personalities, and all of a sudden people began to rally alongside of them, build communities and platforms with them. And the creators essentially became their own brand. And with the creation economy, there's pros and cons. I mean, obviously what me and you are doing right now is sort of like a version of this creation economy. We're able to upload to some of these platforms like Spotify and YouTube. And we're taking advantage of it because it gives us gives people a platform to listen to us. But I think with regards to the pros and cons, there's plenty. Like the people then become celebrities, and it sort of becomes like another beta version of Hollywood, which is all the drama that comes with Hollywood too. It's like you have all this like crazy toxic shit with regards to some of these figures and how people it comes back to the mental health comparison issue, like body image issues of some of these people. So I mean, there's like pros and cons to everything. And the incentives, I think, was same thing with regards to Instagram. I think the more raunchier shit, the more offensive shit some of these people say becomes forefront, because especially if they're blue checkmark or verified people, it goes to the forefront, right? And I think because it creates communities, it also, the same echo chambers in Twitter all often come into YouTube because you have camps now with creators. So you essentially have this weird like cult-like personality. We have the charismatic creator, the leader, and you have all the followers doing whatever the leader says they're going to do. So it's kind of like a weird cult-like sort of entire, like a personality kind of cult thing, right? Which is like this thing is being translated into a video platform and you're kind of relating to that person. And then I think with regards, you're getting, you develop the creator economy, which is a beautiful thing too, because you also get specialized skill sets of channels. Like you have like woodworking channels, and so people relate to this more. So I think it's like the beautiful thing about these online communities, which is that it can be good and bad, because if you have a special interest or a common interest with people, you can meet people across geographies, learn from them, exchange information. So like I said, this issue about regarding social media is pretty much a complicated one. It's not really like a black and white one where you can say like, okay, like ban all these social media companies or break them up. It's like not really hard. It's not really easy thing to do.
And you know, that takes me to like Vine and like TikTok even, because I know with Vine, a lot of people, they were like 7-second videos, and so many celebrities came out of them who are now on YouTube, who did those short videos again, and then they started doing long ones. Now they're famous on Instagram, and then even goes to TikTok now. A lot of new TikTok people are famous as well.
With Gen Z, I'm pretty sure the closest one they can relate to probably got to be TikTok. I think the most actively used social media nowadays is TikTok, and I think people have to ask themselves a question, which is people go on like YouTube binges, but TikTok binges are a thing
now,
because they're short attention. They're dedicated for it's sort of dedicated to people who have short attention spans. But now it's telling creators if they have to limit their creation.
Exactly.
And so it's creating this everlasting like feedback loop that the creators are getting the high off the people, and the people are getting the high off the creators, and that's to replicate. And this is having an effect on our brain chemistry, because the psychology of these people is like, okay, I'm just going to sit there and like consume like scroll these short bursts of information. And with a TikTok, that's the worst for context. Like imagine if you had like a 30-second TikTok of like a huge issue, someone just releases a 30-second TikTok and that's their conclusion. It's like, wait, where was your information? Where's your sources? Like
the funny thing is, I know people that watch TikToks and then also listen to like 3-hour podcasts. It's like,
which is I think the weird duality of this thing, which is so strange, because for the first time in history, you would think that because of the things like instant gratification rising, and how people want to be more instantly gratified versus previously there was a delayed gratification. You would think that all the incentives, mentally speaking, the financial incentives, social incentives, would all be geared towards short-term.
Exactly.
But at the same time, you had this modern day arising of podcasts, and podcasting probably grew out of like alternative media and radio. It's like you had the people who media companies who wanted to tell the news and not let the mainstream media have all the news thing, then they created their YouTube channels and they created the podcasting. And then all of a sudden podcasting became a thing where everyone wanted to be a podcaster, a podcast for technology, podcast for medicine, podcast for this, podcast for that. And so I think it goes back to the social media model, which you have these online communities, but then somehow it's like long form. So it kind of combines a multitude of worlds. So I think it's really interesting. I would wonder like whether or not in this upcoming few years that follow, how these sort of two worlds are going to like diverge and how quickly which one's going to grow. Because if it's just podcasting and favoring of long form conversation around special communities, it would be something pretty cool, because these sort of unique communities that share values would be able to grow as a community. Versus with social media platforms, you have this community, but you have short-term attention spans and short-term content to consume. So I think it's a weird thing to exist all at once. I would assume that the long-term thing would have been dead by now.
Exactly. Yeah. I think it's just because of the whole use of YouTube, right? Like you were saying, it went to vlogging, like went from short to long. I guess people got used to it, right?
The whole binge is that people took that and then realized that they came across like a 3-hour podcast to sit there and be okay with it. Yeah. Because the conversations are interesting nowadays on podcasts. It depends on your personalities. Like I said, like a Rogan has like a 3-hour podcast. People watch, millions of people watch it or listen to it.
I think it's also too, because now you can listen to it while doing like your daily activities, right? Versus like watching things like videos, you have to stand there and watch it, look at it.
I think with podcasts, what's interesting is the fact that you had the arrival of like streaming services. Then you get into like your Spotify
and like Apple Music.
Apple Music and everything, Apple Podcasts. You get into those sort of ideas, and the alternative all of a sudden then therefore became, okay, get up. So I think the argument with there is get off your screen, help your eyes and reduce screen time, be more productive, but will also help you stream. Like music was always a thing, but they realized instead of listening to music, listen to podcasts or audiobooks. And the idea is that this became a thing. And so it's like really insane to think like, I think it truly is like it is a blue ocean strategy thing, because every generation of iterations of technologies has its consequences. And those consequences in the short term are being answered by the next generation of social media. And so it's coming this ever ending cycle of like social media companies, more venture capital. It's pretty funny to see this actually happen. And I think it goes to our sort of two last main ideas we want to hammer home, which is the idea when we talk about the creation of echo chambers, more so like over these personalities. Social media in its entirety, I think, has sort of exasperated a more even bigger beast, which is mental health. We're not saying that. I think people need to realize mental health was always an issue. Like it's not like a new thing. Like people have been depressed for millennia. Like it's not like because someone didn't like my post, I'm gonna just be depressed. Like no, people we know people who are much older than us. Our family members who've been depressed, and it used to be that you went to a bar and you drank your sorrows away. The stereotypical thing to do, but Moreover, the idea of bullying and of mental health issues and of toxicity has now made its way onto social media.
Yeah.
Like we said, I think if you look at social media, it's more of a tool. It depends on who's wielding it. Like a knife can be used to cook amazing food. It can also be used to hurt someone.
Exactly.
I think with social media, it's, as we mentioned, you can have a creator economy, people making immense amounts of income, becoming independent, financially independent, secure. You can also have people sharing horrible things on there, but you can also have people bullying there. You can also have people being toxic to each other.
Like there's so many pros to globalization, but this is like definitely one of the cons.
Yeah, and especially the idea of like instant gratification and rapid communication, which is before, it's like with online communities, is that you can be mobbed like entirely with regards to not just one bully anymore. Now you're facing off against multiple personalities you don't even know because they're anonymous, right?
Yeah, like people create another account after you block them.
Right, like that, exactly. And so that's how I think that the bullying and the toxicity when it comes to social media, anyone can say anything to you at this point without saying it to your face. And I think that's the biggest thing, which is before you said it to your face, you got bullied, you were still be able to hash it out because you are a person. You could bring it up to your teacher at school, especially with young kids. And it's happening to adults too, but not so more bullying, more like mob violence online. But you get surges. One person just gets surged on social media. It's like, hold on a second, I didn't say that. That goes back to context, right? And so I think these ideas of like negative viral moments flooding your brain on the feed, giving you sort of putting you in this weird depressive state that the world is coming to an end. Especially in 2020, we saw how much depraved shit there was on social media. And then you're being fed this depravity all the goddamn time. You come to the conclusion in your head at the end of the day saying like, you know what, like this is fucked. Like this world is so stupid. It's fucked up. And like, I'm like, my brain is getting fucked up like that. Like I'm getting sort of this weird, like parasitic, like mind virus, right? Because whatever you're absorbing is changing your brain chemistry, and you're essentially reflecting your mindset reflecting that. And we know from there, everything goes like south. Because your body reflects your brain and your mental health. And with people who already have mental health issues, being on social media, particularly this year with regards to all the depravity that happened, it put them in a really bad state because first of all, you're already locked up in your home. So you're being fed all this negative information. Never any positive, because like I said, sometimes the positive information really doesn't sell eyeballs, right? And I think we have to understand that if you ever want to figure out some of the problems with regards to some of these companies or any other big problems, it's always follow the financial incentive, follow where the money goes, right? Not saying that the financial incentives are bad. They motivate a tremendous amount of innovation, but sometimes all the toxic shit that comes along with it is generally also financially motivated. So you have to educate yourself in that sense, right? The financial motivations are keep more people on our platform, keep them on here, watch them, sell ads, sell the data, whatever. You just got to keep understanding why people do the things they do and follow the money, especially and I think with bullying and with especially with platforms like Instagram, you see people posting pictures and you have the whole issue of body image with regards to some of these creators or some of these online celebrities. And with regards to celebrities, it's been happening with celebrities always, which is the magazine photos and constant state of comparison. Like, why does her or his body look like that? Why does my body look like this? And so you have an entirely different animal of mental health and bullying, especially on social media, which I think is placating, especially in 2020, which is that people were stuck in their homes and now they're being bombarded with things from these recommending algorithms, and so they're constantly being put in a depressive state. So who knows, like when we come out of this crisis, I think it will be something that we would have to address with regards to, I think mental health has become more and more of a bigger issue now for a different reason. I don't think it's no longer just about bullying. I think it's because people spend so much time on their screens now. And now they're being fed things from these recommender algorithms that are learning closely more and more what this person wants to hear, wants to say, but then sometimes will tell them the most faunchiest things, right?
And it shows you the power of like meeting people in person and learning directly from the source versus from a screen or like from social media.
Yeah, it tells you more so the power of context. I think we learned about there's just like anything online or meeting things in person, you always want to start off with, like when you meet a person, you start off with something you have in common, right? No one ever goes to a person and just yells at them, unless you like have the marginal case. But if you think about it, like social media should be replicating real life. And when you meet someone new or someone anonymous, someone you've never met before, you want to go under the assumption that this person is a human and a decent human being and is not really out to get anyone. And so if I approach this conversation with the idea that like, I want to get to know this person, I'm going to start off by sort of taking a more friendlier approach. And then as you get closer and closer in terms of layer of social circles, you begin to expose more of your own individuality at first, right? But I think there's some things that are common, and I think we're losing that as a society. And I don't think social media is going to go away. I think, in fact, the majority of these so-called short-term TikTok platforms are here to stay.
They're definitely going to grow like even further,
I think where the future lies is in the last section of the podcast episode, which is the idea of the talks of internet or Web 3.0. And this relates back to the whole blockchain and cryptocurrency aspect, which we're hopefully going to get into more episodes in the future.
Sure, for sure, yeah. But that I'm excited about.
Yeah, for sure, definitely. And both of us definitely have financial interest in Bitcoin.
Disclaimer: this is not financial advice.
Advice, yeah. But we definitely have dipped our toes in terms of the crypto, whether more so over the blockchain. So hoping to kind of relay that information to you in a future episode. But
sure, yeah.
I think with regards to the social media argument, from what I've heard with startups and with tokens and coins like Ethereum, because the Ethereum is essentially allowed for things like smart contracts and for decentralized applications to exist
on the blockchain,
on the blockchain, and then it goes back to this arrival of decentralization to last time. So maybe the future answer is that people are tired now of people telling them that things are going to become decentralized and then they become centralized again.
Yeah.
So I think this is probably going to be an answer to big tech and to the media companies and to governments in general, which is hey, like, you know what, centralized mechanisms and centralized forms of power are not really here to help the people in their best interests. And I think what we can do is, look, we can do things on our own now. Hey, we don't need you. And so I think with regards to decentralized social media, it can address problems that are ever so growing, which is the idea of exchanging ideas and information freely, right? The issues of like free speech and what's considered free speech are rising again. And this could be an amazing opportunity for some of these decentralized applications to come in and fill the void.
Exactly.
And I think with some of the access to the internet, you're looking at things like Brave browser. So for those of you guys that don't know, Brave browser is something you can look into. Brave is supposed to be an alternative to like your Google Chromes, your Mozilla Firefoxes of the world. Many uses that still.
But it's built on Chromium, so it's really similar to Chrome, but its differences are like it blocks like trackers and ads and things like that. Yeah.
And I think Brave essentially has understood the sort of called out the perverse incentives of some of these advertisers. And the idea is that they've essentially can educate you. Like, it's your attention that's a commodity, it's your data, because the longer you spend attention there, the more data you're generating from these companies.
And so it's so cool. You can opt into ads and you get their token that they created, like a crypto coin called the basic attention token, which is however many ads you want to view. That's how you get paid. So you're basically getting paid to view ads, but it's optional. So.
And the incentive there is on the individual,
exactly, not on the marketing,
not on the company, right? So I think it's a pretty cool play kit on the psychology, because now the user knows that, okay, I'm basically putting my money, I'm using my money now, right? Because the idea of the attention token is that your time is money, right?
Exactly.
So you're giving time to stupid shit. Understand that you're giving time to stupid shit, right? Like, make sure you know where you're giving your time to and being in control of who you give your time to.
Exactly.
I think this is it's decentralizing the power, like I said. So I think Brave is something to look into, utilizing the incentivization method to help users get better search results and to basically not make search results biased or not to manipulate these search results whenever you search for something, right? And then we even have another third category, which is a startup called Ground News. And for those of you that are constantly interested in being updated on the world's news stories and the world's media stories, Ground News is actually a Chrome extension you can download, but it's a startup that actually has their own media company. They essentially search the entire internet stories as web crawlers, and they actually sort it out into political biases. So how much of a story is particularly right wing, how much of a story is particularly left wing,
or even
how much of a center, and where the biases are. And they'll give you the breakdown of some of the sources. They'll list out all those media companies and independent media that have reported on this and give you a list. So you actually have everything is right over there for you. And I think it's something really good to have, in particular because we're living in an ever so more rapid pace. News stories are coming out left, right, and center.
Exactly.
I think if you're getting your news at least still on the internet in terms of a desktop and laptop sort of point of view, it'd be something to kind of download. The Ground News is pretty good to download. With regards to actually seeing how biased a story is. And if you're willing, as we mentioned last episode, if you're willing to share things on social media with regards to like an issue or something, before you share it, understand, like we said, context.
That's exactly.
And I think with context, when you go online, you generally, like we said, some of the issues that big tech people are mentioning, you're going to get certain narratives. And I think with regards to things like Ground News, more so, or with Brave browser, you're going to get more objective kind of news stories, and you're going to get news stories that are supposed to be non-biased, but more so, even if there is bias, at least you're getting a whole entire spectrum of things to look at. So I think it's something to be looked into.
For sure. But let's go back into our recurring segment, the 3 takeaways. For this episode, we're going to do a shared 3 takeaways because there's not a lot of content we went over. So I guess, Aries, if you want to start with the first one.
Sure. So I guess our first takeaway would be, with regards to social media, everything that you, as a user of any of these social media platforms, with regards to more modern sort of today's issue, is that social media sometimes often being used to, as we mentioned, bully, divide, have a more toxic environment, and sort of create these online communities, right? Which is good. But with regards to the other things that I mentioned, the toxicity, the bullying, understand that sometimes if you're going to attack someone on social media, or if you're going to share something on social media, or if there's any sort of anything that you're about to do on social media that's generated as a viscerality or something of some sort, understand context. I think with as you mentioned previously, with regards to any story, with regards to any event that happens, or sharing on your story, or sharing a post, or sharing a slide. What is that? What thing's called on Instagram? You have like a
highlights.
Sharing anything. Make sure that you understand the context of what exactly you're sharing, and if it's part of an even bigger issue, like some of these news stories, I think I would suggest do your due diligence on some of these things. So context matters.
Yeah, our second takeaway was when you use platforms, understand both the advantages and disadvantages. So although platforms allow content creators like us to distribute our message, there's also disadvantages in terms of how we talked about the privacy and the information they gather. So really know what you're getting into and how to really use it to the best case scenario. And I guess our final takeaway is the whole instant gratification. So we know that it's addicting to go on like Instagram and everything because of all the incentives that they put.
We do that too.
Yeah, I do that a lot. I used to watch TikTok too, and I used to be on it for hours along with Instagram. But I feel like if you take that energy and try to couple it into doing something new, learning something new online, even if it's for like 30 minutes a day, 30 minutes away from social media, go learn something.
Use the same tool, but try to change the system around.
So like, use that gratification that you get, try to get it from another source.
It might take longer, but you have to invest more time in it. But I think the reward, the end goal, the long term, and the long term reward will be much more higher because you're shifting your things away from short term gratification to a bit more medium to long term.
Exactly.
So it's definitely a good way to end.
That's the end of our episode, I guess.
Exactly. That's the end of our episode this week. As we mentioned, we're going to probably go to these next two tracks of focus: mental health and
the whole decentralized
social media. And so, like we said again, we're learning ourselves as co-hosts. We're exploring topics and break them down for you in terms of a Gen Z perspective, and we'll continue to bring you guys good quality guests and everything else.
It's fun to research this, and if you guys have any topics you want to hear about, let us know.
Message us, leave comments in the YouTube videos, or just message us on any of our social medias, tweet at us, whatever. And we would love to have more of our audience be a bit more interactive with us on YouTube.
For sure.
I think the comment section is always going to be open. There's never going to be a time we're going to censor anything, considering we're advocates of just people being able to openly say whatever the hell they want to say, dislike if you want to, and to tell us why, or tell us like we can improve on.
Exactly.
So I was looking for
we're open for that constructive criticism.
And we're also looking for dialogue always. And I think the beautiful thing about as we said, online creators and content creators is to create these online communities where people don't have to fear to say things and just have honest discussions, because if we want to live in a new world and we don't want it to go haywire, we have to build it ourselves.
Exactly.
So on that note, we'll end it right there. Thank you so much for joining us this week.
Cool. Take care, guys.
We'll see you next time. Bye. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Be sure to like, subscribe, comment, and share. Check us out for an audio-only experience on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other outlets. Follow us on all of our social media, and please consider supporting us on Patreon. All of these links will be in the description. That's it for us today. Welcome to the new world.